I slid the heavy manila envelope across the white linen tablecloth of the most expensive steakhouse in downtown Chicago. Inside was the deed to a brick warehouse in Fulton Market, a property I had bled to acquire. It was my gift to my son Marcus for his supposed early retirement. Marcus, sitting there in a custom $3,000 suit, picked up the envelope. He pulled out the deed, glanced at the address, and let out a scoff that cut right through the noise of the crowded restaurant. He slid the envelope back across the table, his eyes full of condescension. "Mom, we do not need a storage unit," he said, speaking to me slowly, as if I were a child. Beside him, his wife Chloe let out a loud, mocking laugh, making sure the neighboring tables could hear. "It is just an old building, Mama Vivi," she announced, swirling her $200 glass of champagne. "We are moving to a gated community in the North Shore. Keep that dusty brick box for your gardening supplies." I said absolutely nothing. I picked up the envelope, placed it calmly back into my purse, and finished my meal. The next morning, I picked up my phone and called my corporate attorney, Diane. She looked over the documents I sent her, and her voice went dead serious. "Vivian, are you absolutely certain you want to do this?" I looked out my window at the city I had conquered. "Absolutely certain," I replied. "Execute the protocol. I am Vivian Hayes, 68 years old, and I spent 40 years clawing my way from the bottom of the Chicago commercial real estate market to build an empire of my own." But the hardest battles I ever fought were not in boardrooms. They were against the very blood I raised. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that respect is earned, not owed, and that no one gets a free pass to disrespect their elders. Now, let me tell you how a simple dinner turned into a war. The atmosphere in that steakhouse should have been my first warning. Marcus had invited me out to celebrate his sudden decision to retire at the age of 45. He acted like he was the king of the world, snapping his fingers at the waitstaff and loudly ordering the most expensive imported wines on the menu. But a woman who built a fortune from nothing knows how to spot a fake. I noticed how he sweated when the waiter brought the bill. I noticed how he handed over a shiny gold credit card, and I definitely noticed when the waiter returned a few minutes later, leaning down to quietly inform my son that the card had been declined, not once, but twice. Marcus played it off, laughing too loud, pulling out a different card and blaming a bank error. Chloe sat next to him, smoothing down a designer dress she could barely afford, completely oblivious to her husband's panic. But the person who was not oblivious was my 17-year-old grandson, Trey. Trey sat quietly at the end of the table. He did not touch his steak. He just kept his hands clenched tightly in his lap under the table. I saw the way he looked at his parents. It was not the look of a proud son celebrating his father. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Trey had always been different. He inherited my late husband's quiet intelligence and my sharp instincts. By the time he was 15, he was already a data forensics prodigy, building computer networks and understanding digital footprints better than most professionals. He knew something was wrong that night, and he knew I knew it too. When Marcus rejected the deed to the Fulton Market building, treating a multi-million-dollar piece of commercial real estate like it was a piece of garbage, Trey looked at me with eyes begging me to see the truth. I did not make a scene. I let Marcus and Chloe play their parts, boasting about their imaginary mansion in the North Shore, pretending they were the elite. I let them pay the bill with whatever credit they had left, and I went home to my quiet house. I had not become suspicious of Marcus because a credit card was declined. Anyone can have a card blocked. What disturbed me was the way he reacted to embarrassment. He did not ask the waiter to try again quietly. He raised his voice, blamed the bank, mocked the restaurant's payment system, and made sure everyone at the table understood that the problem could not possibly belong to him. I had seen that habit growing in him for years. Success had taught him to treat correction as insult. Chloe encouraged it because his image supported hers. The North Shore addressed the leased cars, the private club photographs, the expensive dinners were not comforts anymore. They were evidence they presented to the world that they had won. Trey was the only person at that table who looked exhausted by the performance. That was part of why his midnight visit hurt so much. Marcus had not grown up rich. He remembered the years when I carried folders from one property showing to another because I could not afford an assistant. He remembered his father repairing boilers on weekends and me balancing closing statements at the kitchen table after midnight. I had paid for Marcus's education so he would have choices, not so he would learn contempt for the work that created those choices. The Fulton warehouse was not glamorous, but I had bought it when the neighborhood was unfashionable and held it through years when other investors laughed at the location. Giving it to him had been my way of offering both value and history. His rejection told me he had forgotten the second half completely. That night, the silence of my home was broken by the soft click of my back door unlocking. It was past midnight. I was sitting in the dark in my home office, staring at the envelope Marcus had so casually rejected. The door to my office pushed open, and Trey slipped inside. He wore a dark hoodie, his backpack slung over one shoulder, breathing heavy, like he had run all the way from their house. He did not bother with pleasantries. He dropped his heavy backpack onto the floor, pulled out his laptop, and set it squarely on my desk. "Nana," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Dad did not retire. He was fired." I sat back in my chair, letting the words sink in. Fired. From a senior executive position, men like Marcus do not just get fired without a massive fallout. I watched as Trey's fingers flew across his keyboard. The screen lit up my dark office, casting a pale blue glow across my grandson's exhausted face. "I pulled the metadata from their home network," Trey explained, bringing up a series of internal corporate emails and bank statements. He thought deleting his browsing history was enough, but he is sloppy. "Nana, look at this." I leaned forward. The screen displayed a termination letter from Marcus's firm. It was not a polite parting of ways. It was a brutal, immediate dismissal. The words misappropriation of client funds and pending legal action glared back at me. Trey clicked to another screen, bringing up Marcus and Chloe's joint financial statements. The numbers were a bloodbath. They were $600,000 in debt. The luxury cars they bragged about were months behind on lease payments. The North Shore mansion Chloe had been bragging about to the entire restaurant just hours ago was already in the early stages of pre-foreclosure. They were drowning, putting on a masquerade of wealth, while their entire financial foundation was crumbling into dust. "Why did he not just come to me?" I asked softly, though the anger was already beginning to coil tight in my chest. If he was in trouble, why put on that ridiculous show at the restaurant? Why mock a gift that could have saved him? Trey looked at me, and I saw a terrible sadness in his young eyes. "Because he does not want your help, Nana. He wants your money. All of it." Trey opened a new window. "This is why he rejected the building," he said. He brought up an email Marcus had sent to his personal accountant just 2 days prior. The email detailed the property tax records for the Fulton Market building. Marcus had done just enough research to see that the building had a $40,000 property tax bill coming due next month. He did not see a valuable commercial asset sitting in one of the most rapidly developing neighborhoods in Chicago. He only saw an immediate bill that he could not afford to pay. He rejected the deed because he did not have a single dime to cover the holding costs of the property. But that was not the worst part. "Read the next email," Trey whispered. I adjusted my glasses and read the message Marcus had sent to his accountant. The words burned themselves into my memory forever. "Let the old lady keep the brick box. It is a liability. We do not need illiquid assets. We need cash. I am meeting with Dr. Vance tomorrow. We are filing for medical conservatorship over her liquid accounts next week. She has $8 million sitting in cash reserves. Once she is declared incompetent, I get complete control of the trust." The room went completely still. The hum of the computer fan was the only sound. My own son, the boy I carried, the boy I worked double shifts to put through private school, was plotting to declare me legally insane to steal $8 million. He was not asking for a loan. He was not asking for a bailout. I was planning to erase my independence, strip me of my human rights, and lock me in a legal cage so he could drain my life savings to pay off his massive fraudulent debts. "He wants to put you in a home," Nana Trey said, his voice breaking. He showed me a folder he had uncovered on Chloe's cloud drive. It was labeled Mom's Transition. Inside were bookmarks and brochures for cheap state-run bottom-tier nursing facilities miles outside of the city. Places where they warehouse the elderly and throw away the key. Places where people go to be forgotten. While she sat there drinking champagne and calling me Mama Vivi, Chloe had been actively pricing out the cheapest possible facility to dump me in. I looked at my grandson. He was terrified. He was a teenager who had just uncovered a horrific conspiracy engineered by his own parents against the grandmother he loved. He was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to break down, to yell, to show the devastation that any normal mother would feel upon realizing her child was a monster. I did not cry. I closed the laptop, looked at Trey, and began deciding what had to be protected before Marcus made his next move. I reached across the desk and closed Trey's laptop gently. I looked my grandson dead in the eye. My voice was calm, steady, and cold as ice. "Trey," I said, "I want you to go home. I want you to act completely normal. You do not argue with them. You do not let them know you saw anything. Can you do that for me?" He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "What are you going to do, Nana?" I picked up the manila envelope containing the deed to the Fulton Market building. "Go home," I told him. "Act normal. Save only what comes to you lawfully and send copies to Diane. Do not confront either of them. I will handle the rest." Trey nodded, his fear slowly being replaced by the same cold determination I felt. "I have got you, Nana. They do not know who they are messing with." He slipped back out into the night, leaving me alone with the truth. I did not sleep. I sat in my office, and I planned. By sunrise, I had a legal pad full of names, dates, accounts, and questions for Diane. I did not yet know what the final answer would look like, and that was exactly how I wanted it. At exactly 8 in the morning, I made the call to Diane. Diane was a shark of a corporate attorney. She did not deal in emotions. She dealt in airtight legal destruction. When I told her to execute the protocol, she knew exactly what I meant. The first step was quiet. Within 24 hours, Diane had drawn up the paperwork to completely sever Marcus from my estate. Every medical directive, every emergency contact form, every contingent power of attorney that had his name on it was legally vaporized. But that was just defensive. Everything beyond that would depend on what Marcus chose to do next. I knew Marcus was going to move fast. If he was $600,000 in debt and facing potential criminal charges from his former employer for embezzlement, he was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. He needed to prove I was mentally unfit. He needed to build a case that I was losing my mind, which meant he and Chloe were going to start looking for evidence of my decline. I decided not to interrupt him while he built his case. I knew the conflict was escalating, but I had no idea just how dark Chloe was willing to get to secure her false diagnosis. They were not just going to wait for me to act senile. They were preparing to actively destroy my mind. I did not have to imagine the danger for long. The next morning started like any other Tuesday in my life. I woke up at 5 o'clock, brewed my black coffee, and prepared to inspect a new commercial development I was acquiring near the Bronzeville neighborhood. I walked into my kitchen and took my daily blood pressure medication from the weekly organizer sitting on the granite island. Chloe had recently insisted on filling the organizer for me. She claimed it was her way of helping out and ensuring I stayed healthy. I thought she was just trying to kiss up after the disaster at the restaurant party. I swallowed the red and white capsule, grabbed my car keys, and headed out the door. 30 minutes later, I was driving my Mercedes down Lakeshore Drive. The morning traffic was moving fast, the sun glaring off the waters of Lake Michigan. Suddenly, the dashboard instruments began to blur in front of my eyes. A thick, heavy fog rolled into my brain with terrifying speed. It was not normal fatigue. It felt like thick, dark syrup filling the inside of my skull. My hands grew completely numb on the leather steering wheel. The lines on the highway twisted together. The car drifted hard out of my lane. A horn blared loudly right next to my ear, shaking my bones. I jerked the steering wheel to the right. The tires screeched violently against the concrete curb, sending a jolt through the entire chassis. I slammed my foot on the brakes, throwing my body forward against the seatbelt lock. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I sat there on the side of the busy road, gasping for air, staring at my visibly shaking hands. I pride myself on having a razor-sharp mind. I negotiate complex, multi-million-dollar commercial real estate contracts in my sleep. But sitting in that driver's seat, I could not remember where I was going. I could barely remember the route back to my own house. The sheer confusion terrified me deeply, but the terror quickly morphed into a cold, creeping suspicion. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and dialed my grandson. Trey picked up on the second ring. I told him exactly what happened. I told him my head felt like it was wrapped in wet cotton and my vision was swimming. He told me to lock the car doors, leave the vehicle parked, and call a cab immediately. He promised he would meet me at my house. When I stumbled through my front door, Trey was already waiting in the foyer. He had his backpack open on my dining room table. Black wires, tiny lenses, and a toolkit were scattered across the polished wood. He took one look at my dilated pupils and my unsteady, swaying balance. He rushed forward, guided me to the sofa, and handed me a glass of cold water. "You do not have dementia, Nana," he said quietly, his voice tight with anger. "Someone is actively doing this to you." He pointed toward the kitchen. "Who has access to your daily pills?" I told him Chloe had filled my weekly pill organizer just 2 days ago. Trey did not waste another second. He dragged a wooden stool over to the kitchen counter and carefully positioned a tiny camera inside the air vent above the island, angled toward the medication tray. He synced the feed to a secure storage drive so that anything it captured would be preserved with a clear timestamp. I did not destroy the remaining capsules. Instead, I used clean gloves to place the organizer inside a sealed food container, put it in a locked drawer, and switched to a fresh prescription bottle that Chloe had never touched. If someone had tampered with my medication, those capsules were evidence, and I was done throwing evidence away. Then I went upstairs, drank water, called my regular physician to report the frightening episode, and rested while Trey watched the feed. The following Sunday morning, my head was completely clear. I was sitting at the kitchen island drinking my tea when Trey walked through the back door. His face was pale and drawn tight. He opened his laptop without saying good morning and turned the screen toward me. "This was recorded at 3 a.m. last night," he said. The black and white night vision footage showed my dark kitchen in perfect clarity. A figure crept cautiously into the frame from the hallway. It was Chloe. She was wearing expensive silk pajamas and light purple latex gloves. I watched my daughter-in-law look over her shoulder twice to make sure the hallway was completely empty. Then she reached for my daily pill organizer. She popped open the compartment for Monday. She took out my standard blood pressure capsule and carefully twisted the two halves apart. She tapped the actual medicinal powder down the sink drain and washed it away. Then she pulled a small plastic baggie from her robe pocket. It was filled with a crushed, coarse white substance. She meticulously scooped the foreign powder into the empty halves of my capsule, pressed them firmly back together, and placed the tainted pill back into the organizer. She repeated this exact process for every single day of the week. When she finished, she wiped the granite counter with a damp cloth to remove any stray powder and sneaked back out of the kitchen. I stared at the laptop screen. The blood in my veins turned to ice. "She is poisoning me," I stated, the brutal reality settling heavily into my chest. Trey nodded grimly and opened a second screen. He told me he could not identify a drug by looking at powder on a video, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. What he could show me was Chloe's recent browsing trail and a set of messages in which she had been trying to obtain a powerful sedating compound through an illegal source. The symptoms listed in those messages matched what had happened to me on Lakeshore Drive: confusion, impaired balance, slurred speech, and memory disruption. That was enough to make the danger real, but not enough to prove what the substance was. For that, we would need an accredited laboratory and a proper chain of custody. The distinction mattered to me. I was not interested in rumors or revenge built on guesses. If Marcus and Chloe were trying to manufacture dementia, I wanted proof that could survive a courtroom. They were manufacturing my dementia. Marcus and Chloe were systematically poisoning my brain so they could drag me in front of a judge and have me declared legally incompetent. They wanted to steal my entire real estate empire, and they were willing to physically destroy my mind to achieve their goal. The betrayal was so deep it physically ached in my bones. But the pain vanished almost instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating, and ruthless fury. Later that same afternoon, the front door of my house swung open. Marcus walked in, projecting the false confidence of a devoted, loving son. Behind him was a man I did not recognize. He wore an expensive, tailored suit, but his eyes were shifty, constantly scanning my living room and assessing the expensive artwork on the walls. "Mom," Marcus called out cheerfully, walking into the living room. "I brought a friend over to say hello. This is Dr. Vance. We were just in the neighborhood and wanted to check on you." I knew exactly what this was. This was the medical ambush. I had anticipated their move the moment Trey showed me the footage, but I was not foolish enough to swallow another tampered capsule. The residue of the earlier exposure still left me tired and unsteady, and I used that weakness as part of the performance. I let my shoulders sag, slowed my speech, and allowed my eyes to drift as if concentration itself exhausted me. If they wanted to see a broken, confused old woman, I could give them the picture they had already decided to believe without putting another dose of poison into my body. Dr. Vance sat down in the armchair directly across from me. He smiled, offering a greasy, highly practiced expression of fake medical concern. "Vivian, it is a pleasure to meet you," he said smoothly, opening a leather-bound notepad. "Marcus tells me you have been feeling a bit under the weather lately, forgetting things, getting confused about your daily routine." I stared at him, letting my mouth hang slightly open. I gripped the armrests of my sofa, letting my hands shake visibly. "Who are you?" I slurred, slumping my shoulders forward and looking around the room frantically. "Where is my husband?" My husband had been dead for over 10 years. Marcus shot a victorious, greedy look at Dr. Vance. The corrupt doctor leaned forward, tapping his pen against the notepad. "Vivian, can you tell me what year it is?" he asked gently. "Can you count backward from 100 by 7s for me?" I stared blankly at the floor. I mumbled a few random numbers and then trailed off into total silence. The performance was physically exhausting because the veterinary drugs were actively fighting my concentration, trying to pull me under. But I played the part to absolute perfection. I looked like nothing but an empty, fading shell of a woman who could no longer care for herself. Dr. Vance patted my knee condescendingly. "Rest now, Vivian. You are in very good hands." He stood up and signaled to Marcus. The two men walked out of the living room and stepped into the hallway, leaving me alone. They thought I was far too sedated to move or understand what was happening. But Trey was already perfectly positioned at the top of the stairs, his phone actively recording clear audio of their conversation. The hallway audio feed was crisp and undeniable. "She is completely gone," Dr. Vance whispered, shifting his weight. "The cognitive decline is severe and rapid. I will sign the preliminary incompetence evaluation right now. It is more than enough for you to file the emergency conservatorship tomorrow morning." Marcus sighed loudly, sounding relieved. "Thank you, man. I really appreciate this. We just want to make sure she and her assets are protected from exploitation." Then came the sound of thick paper changing hands. Trey's recording captured the unmistakable heavy rustle of a cash envelope being exchanged. "That covers the remaining gambling debt I owe you," Marcus told the corrupt neurologist. "We are officially even. Submit the medical paperwork to the county clerk before noon tomorrow." The front door closed behind them. I stayed slumped on the sofa until Trey's footsteps reached the bottom stair. Then I lifted my head and asked him whether the recording had captured the exchange clearly. It had. The next morning, the last of the heavy fog had finally lifted from my brain. I woke with a pounding headache, but with my thoughts arranged in their proper order again. I photographed the medication organizer exactly as I had found it, sealed each suspicious capsule in a separate evidence bag, and wrote the date and compartment on every label. Chloe could still believe I was taking her altered pills because I replaced the visible organizer with harmless look-alike vitamin capsules and continued removing one each morning. The original capsules stayed locked away. I had survived one reckless exposure. I was not going to survive a second one merely to make my enemies feel confident. I dressed in a sharp-tailored business suit and went to a private toxicology clinic in the financial district. I brought the sealed capsules, explained that I believed my medication had been tampered with, and requested an expedited toxicology panel on both my blood and the retained capsule contents. The clinic documented the samples, identified a potent sedating compound that did not belong in my prescription, and produced a certified report linking the substance in the capsules to the substance detected in my bloodstream. For the first time since the near crash, I felt the ground become solid beneath my feet. The video showed Chloe altering my medicine. The laboratory showed what the alteration had done to my body. Together, those two pieces of evidence were far stronger than any frightened accusation I could have made on the day I nearly lost control of my car. I did not rush to the police station that afternoon. Diane wanted the evidence preserved correctly, and the connection between the altered capsules Dr. Vance and Marcus documented before anyone had a chance to destroy records or coordinate a story. For once, patience felt more dangerous than anger, but I followed her advice. I made copies of the toxicology report, gave one sealed copy to Diane, and placed another with the retained capsules inside a secure bank box. Diane arranged for an independent evidence custodian to preserve the originals properly. I wanted no argument later about missing pills, altered files, or contaminated samples. Marcus had built his plan around the assumption that an older woman's confusion would be easy to dismiss. I was building my defense around documentation. By the next afternoon, Diane had turned my quiet home office into a temporary command center without ever raising her voice. A geriatric specialist who had never met Marcus or Dr. Vance examined me after the sedative had cleared. Then a second physician did the same. They asked me the date, the names of my companies, the purpose of several trusts, the balance of a pending acquisition, and why I had changed my medical directives. I answered every question and corrected one of them when he misstated a parcel number. Neither doctor cared about family drama. That was the point. Their reports would say only what they had observed. I was oriented, capable of understanding complex financial decisions, and able to explain the consequences of my choices. Diane filed those reports with a notice opposing any emergency conservatorship before Marcus could obtain an order based on Dr. Vance alone. She did not announce the filing to him. She let the clerk's office do that. At 4:17, my phone rang. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring 6 times before answering. "Mom," he said too softly, "why did you hire another doctor?" I stared at the rain sliding down the glass and asked him which doctor he meant. There was a pause. Then his voice sharpened. "The court doctor, the one Diane filed. You were not supposed to do that." I let another pause stretch. "Supposed to?" I asked. He recovered badly, telling me he was only worried that too many appointments would confuse me. Behind his words, I could hear Chloe asking who had warned Diane. I said I was tired and ended the call. 10 minutes later, Trey texted me a screenshot. Marcus had sent him a message ordering his own son to stop visiting me because I was becoming agitated. Trey did not answer. Diane told him not to. The next morning, Marcus appeared at my front door carrying groceries, flowers, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Chloe stood behind him with a casserole dish and a large purse. I let them in. Marcus spoke slowly, touching my elbow whenever I stood, while Chloe drifted through the downstairs rooms under the excuse of looking for serving spoons. She opened the wrong drawer in the dining room, then the cabinet beneath my desk, then the shallow box where I used to keep closing papers. I watched her from the reflection in the dark television screen. I did not challenge her. I asked whether she had found the napkins. She jumped, closed the drawer, and said she was trying to help. At dinner, Marcus placed a 1-page medical release beside my plate and told me it would make appointments easier. The signature line was marked with a yellow tab. I picked up the pen, studied the page for a long time, then wrote the date in the signature box and my name on the line intended for the witness. Chloe's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Marcus took the paper from me and forced a laugh. "No problem, Mom. We can do it later." He folded the useless form and slipped it into his jacket. They left before dessert. I stood at the front window and watched Chloe argue with him beside their car, stabbing a finger toward the house. I could not hear the words, but I did not need an interpretation. Their timetable was slipping, and for the first time I could see it in the way they moved. Marcus shifted his attention to Trey before the court could schedule the next hearing. At 3:20 on Friday afternoon, Trey called me from a public library near his school instead of from his own phone. He kept his voice low. "Dad took my laptop," he said. "He told me I was not allowed to visit you unless he was present." I asked whether Marcus had threatened him. Not exactly. He said I was confused and that Diane was using me against the family. Then he asked for my passwords because he wanted to make sure I was not being manipulated too. I told Trey not to fight him and not to try to recover the laptop. Anything important had already been preserved by the independent examiner. His safety mattered more than another message. Trey was quiet for several seconds. Then he asked the question I had been avoiding. "What if they know I showed you the emails I told him we would act as if they did not?" Diane arranged for Trey to stay with a trusted relative for the weekend if he felt unsafe, but Trey refused to make a dramatic exit from his parents' house without a reason a court could understand. He went home. That evening, Marcus brought him to my house for dinner without warning. The 3 of them arrived together, Marcus carrying a bottle of wine, Chloe carrying dessert. Trey walking 2 steps behind them with no laptop and no expression. Marcus announced that families should not let lawyers divide them. He poured wine for everyone except Trey and raised a glass to fresh starts. I let him talk. Chloe asked whether I had remembered where I put my important papers. Marcus asked whether I had been sleeping well. Neither asked why Trey looked pale. Halfway through dinner, Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said Trey had been spending too much time on computers. He told me they were considering sending him to a private leadership camp for a few weeks so he could disconnect. Trey kept his eyes on his plate. I asked when the camp started. Monday, Chloe said. Diane had already warned me that sudden travel could be used to remove Trey from the immediate evidence chain or simply keep him from me. I did not object at the table. Instead, I asked Marcus whether the camp required both parents to sign. He said, of course. I nodded as though the answer had no importance. After they left, I called Diane. By midnight, she had sent a preservation letter to Marcus's attorney and a notice that Trey might be a material witness in the pending capacity matter and associated evidence dispute. She did not accuse anyone of kidnapping their son or invent a crisis. She simply made sudden removal inconvenient enough to attract questions. The camp disappeared from conversation the next morning. Marcus never mentioned it again. Trey returned to school on Monday. His laptop remained confiscated, which turned out to be a gift. Without it, he could not be accused of continuing to access anything. He started using a school computer only for homework and called me from ordinary places at ordinary times. Our relationship became simpler. I stopped asking him for information. He stopped trying to save me through technology. When we spoke, I asked about calculus college applications and whether he had eaten. That change mattered later, because Marcus could no longer claim Trey had become my private investigator. He was a grandson who had seen something frightening preserved what he already had and then stepped back. The adults would have to carry the case from there. Thursday morning brought a heavy rain that lashed against the windows of my kitchen. I was sitting at the granite island drinking a cup of herbal tea, watching the local financial news network on the flat-screen television. The anchor broke into the regular broadcast with a major developing story. A massive global technology conglomerate named Apex Innovations had just officially announced the location for their new Midwest corporate headquarters. It was a $1.2 billion development project. The screen shifted to a detailed architectural rendering of the proposed campus. I recognized the street grid immediately. It was the Fulton Market district. The anchor explained that Apex had been secretly acquiring dozens of surrounding lots through proxy buyers over the past 12 months. However, their entire architectural design hinged on one central parcel of land, a single, heavy brick warehouse currently owned by an anonymous holding company. The anchor brought on a commercial real estate expert who stated that whoever owned that central warehouse held the ultimate leverage over the entire tech giant. The property, previously valued at perhaps $800,000, was now estimated to be worth at least $35 million, simply because Apex could not complete their mega campus without it. Less than 20 minutes later, the aggressive screech of tires tore through the quiet morning of my neighborhood. A heavy car door slammed shut outside. Rushed heavy footsteps pounded up my front porch steps. The front door flew open. Marcus stood in the foyer. His tailored suit jacket was severely wrinkled. His silk tie was pulled loose and hanging crooked. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down his neck. He did not bother greeting me. He stormed directly into the living room, his eyes darting frantically across the coffee table, the sideboards, and the mantel. He was hunting for the brown manila envelope he had so arrogantly pushed away just a few days ago. He turned to me, his voice trembling with a manic, wild desperation. He demanded to know where the envelope was. He told me he made a terrible mistake, and he wanted the storage unit back right now. I did not flinch. I let my shoulders sag forward, rounding my posture to look fragile, small, and lost. I slowly looked up from the old photograph album resting on my lap. I let my eyes drift entirely out of focus, staring blankly just past his left shoulder. I asked him who he was looking for. I called him by the name of the man who cuts my lawn. Marcus froze. His jaw dropped open. He stepped closer, waving his trembling hands in front of my face, shouting my name over and over. He begged me to stop playing games. He screamed that he needed the deed to the Fulton building immediately, or his life was over. I tilted my head and offered him a vacant, childlike smile. I told him the house felt too cluttered lately. I told him the brown envelope felt heavy with bad memories and negative energy. I whispered that I took all the old dusty papers from my desk and threw them into the backyard incinerator early this morning. I smiled wider and told him they burned beautifully, turning into soft gray ash that blew away in the wind. The blood completely drained from the face of my son. He stared at me with an expression of pure, unhinged horror. He let out a primal, guttural scream that vibrated the glass in the window panes. He lunged forward and snatched the heavy photograph album right out of my hands, throwing it violently across the room. The spine cracked sharply against the hardwood floor, scattering loose family photographs everywhere. He began pacing the room like a trapped, desperate animal. He knocked over a heavy brass floor lamp, sending it crashing onto the rug. He screamed that I was a worthless, senile burden. He cursed my existence. He yelled that I just burned $35 million. He screamed that I just destroyed his only chance to pay off his debts and stay out of federal prison. He kicked the glass coffee table, shattering the thick pane into 1,000 jagged pieces across the carpet. He pointed a shaking finger at me, told me I was dead to him, and stormed out of the house. He slammed the front door so hard the hinges rattled in the frame. I did not move a single muscle until I heard his engine roar down the street and fade into the distance. Then I sat up perfectly straight. I brushed a small speck of dust off my trousers. I looked up toward the second-floor landing. Trey stepped out from the deep shadows of the staircase. I was holding his smartphone steady in his hands. The camera lens was pointed directly at the shattered coffee table and the ruined living room. He walked down the stairs, his face completely stoic and unreadable. He told me he recorded every single second of the outburst. We now had crystal-clear high-definition video of Marcus violently destroying my property, verbally abusing an elderly woman, and openly confessing to facing federal prison time. It was an absolute masterpiece of self-incrimination. I told Trey to upload the video file to our secure encrypted server immediately. For the first time since Trey had shown me the conservatorship email, I understood the full shape of Marcus's desperation. The warehouse had changed the scale of the game overnight. Before the Apex announcement, he believed my $8 million in liquid reserves were the prize, and the building was an inconvenience. Now the piece of property he had mocked in public had become the one asset that might erase his debts, buy him new lawyers, restore his social standing, and give him a way to pretend the last month had never happened. His outburst proved he was no longer thinking strategically. He was reacting to each threat as it appeared, grabbing at whatever looked like immediate rescue. That made him more dangerous, but it also made him predictable. I walked slowly through the living room with Trey and photographed every broken object before we touched anything. The shattered coffee table, the bent lamp, the family photographs scattered across the floor, and the gouge his shoe had left in the baseboard became another record of the man behind the polished suit. Diane told me not to repair the room yet. She wanted a contractor's estimate, the original video, and still photographs preserved. Marcus had spent weeks trying to create a record that I was unstable. Now he had created a record of his own instability in my home, with his own voice explaining why $35 million mattered more to him than his mother's safety. The Apex announcement also gave me a problem I could not solve by simply waiting. A public development of that size would attract brokers, title researchers, lenders, speculators, and lawyers. Marcus would not be the only person looking at the parcel. If I wanted to protect the building and still let him reveal the rest of his plan, I needed to move before the market noise reached every public database. Diane and I reviewed the chain of title that afternoon. Fulton Brick Holdings had owned the property for years because that structure had once been convenient for taxes and management, but there was nothing sacred about keeping the deed there. Diane explained that we could transfer the real estate into a blind trust while leaving the old LLC in existence. The transaction would have to be genuine, documented, and completed before anyone tried to encumber the property. I authorized her to prepare it. At the same time, Trey continued watching only the records and accounts he already had lawful access to through shared family systems and material voluntarily synced by his parents. I told him I did not want heroics. I did not want him breaking into protected systems or creating evidence a defense lawyer could attack. His job was to preserve what came to him, not to manufacture access. That evening, Marcus did not call me. Chloe did. Her voice was sugary, almost playful, as if the scene in my living room had never happened. She asked whether I was feeling better and whether I remembered Marcus visiting. I let a long silence sit between us, then asked if she meant the nice man who had come to fix the lamp. I heard her exhale. The relief on the other end of the phone was so obvious that I nearly laughed. She told me to rest and promised she would come by soon to help with my papers. After we hung up, Trey showed me a shared folder that had suddenly appeared in a cloud directory connected to one of Chloe's work devices. The folder contained scans of my old signatures gathered from holiday cards, lease amendments, and charitable acknowledgments. There were several versions of the Fulton Brick Holdings letterhead and a draft acceptance form dated weeks earlier, back when the warehouse was still being described inside their messages as a useless storage unit. I did not need a forensic expert to tell me what she was preparing. Marcus could not find the deed he thought I had burned, so Chloe was going to manufacture a paper trail saying I had already transferred the building before I became incompetent. I felt a different kind of anger then. Poisoning me had been intimate and cruel, but forgery revealed how thoroughly they had reduced me to a collection of exploitable signatures. My handwriting, my medical history, my age, my property, even my relationships inside the church were tools to them. Nothing belonged to me in their minds if they could invent a document saying otherwise. Diane's response was immediate: do not confront them, do not warn them, and do not alter whatever they had already created. Let the attempted fraud develop far enough that intent could be demonstrated, but make sure the true deed was beyond reach. By midnight, the transfer papers for the blind trust were ready for execution. The old warehouse that Marcus had refused at dinner was about to become legally invisible to the shell company he was desperate to steal. I went to bed knowing the next move would belong to Chloe, and for once I wanted her to make exactly the mistake she was planning. The morning after Marcus destroyed my living room, the house smelled of dust and splintered wood. A contractor boarded the cracked section of the coffee table area, while an insurance adjuster photographed the broken lamp, the damaged floor, and the frame that had been knocked from the wall. Diane made me treat the scene like any other property loss. No dramatic cleanup, no social media post, no phone call to Marcus demanding an apology. The adjuster asked who caused the damage. I said my son had become angry during a visit, and that video existed. She wrote it down and moved on. At 11, Marcus called. His first sentence was an apology. His second was a question about the envelope. "Mom yesterday got out of hand," he said. "I am under pressure." I should not have yelled. I thanked him for saying so. He waited. Then he asked whether I was absolutely certain I had burned the deed. I told him the ash had already been collected with the yard waste. He swore under his breath and ended the call. At noon, Chloe arrived in an SUV with two men wearing work gloves. She told my housekeeper they were there to inspect the backyard incinerator because Marcus feared I had accidentally destroyed tax documents. My housekeeper called me before letting anyone through the gate. I stood on the porch and told Chloe there would be no search. She changed her tone immediately. "Mama Vivi, we are trying to help you." One of the men looked embarrassed and stepped away from the truck. I asked Chloe whether she had a warrant, a court order, or ownership of the house. She stared at me. For 1 second, I worried I had sounded too sharp for the confused woman she expected. Then I let my expression drift and asked why she had brought gardeners in suits. Chloe's face relaxed. She told the men to leave. As the SUV pulled away, I saw her photographing the side of the house through the passenger window. Diane later arranged a temporary no trespass notice for anyone, Marcus or Chloe hired, without my permission. Again, she kept the response narrow. We were building boundaries, not theater. That afternoon, a package arrived from Marcus by courier. Inside was a bouquet card, a handwritten apology, and a proposed family property inventory form asking me to list every deed, bank account, safe deposit box, insurance policy, and trust. The form looked harmless until the final page authorized Marcus to communicate with financial institutions on my behalf. I tore off the authorization page and gave the entire packet to Diane. She laughed once without humor. "He keeps asking you to hand him the keys," she said. I asked what would happen if I signed. She said we would never find out. I liked that answer. By evening, the broken glass was gone and the room was usable again, but I left the damaged brass lamp in the corner. Trey noticed it the next time he visited. "Why keep that?" he asked. "Because I do not want every consequence cleaned up before I have learned from it," I said. He looked at the bent metal, then nodded. Outside, the city was still talking about Apex and the $35 million estimate. Inside my house, Marcus had gone from rejecting the building to searching ashes for a deed in less than a week. I did not need to describe his state of mind. The tracks were visible in my backyard. The next morning, Chloe made the mistake Diane had been waiting for. Trey came into my office with his laptop open and a newly created PDF on the screen. It claimed that I had accepted a backdated transfer involving the Fulton Market property weeks before the Apex announcement. My signature sat at the bottom in blue ink. At a glance, it looked like mine. The notary block had been lifted from an older closing packet, the spacing matched my usual forms, and the document carried just enough official language to impress anyone who wanted to believe it. The file history told a different story. The PDF had been created after the Apex press release edited under Chloe's user account and exported from software installed on her personal laptop. Trey had also found the message in which she sent it to a title inquiry portal and attached it to a request for urgent financing. He started explaining how he could trace each edit, but Diane cut him off when we called her. "Preserve the original. Do not alter anything. Do not go looking for more," she said. She arranged for an independent digital forensics examiner to make a verified copy, so the case would not depend on a teenager telling a court what he had seen on a family computer. Trey looked almost offended until I reminded him that evidence becomes stronger when the person presenting it has no reason to protect me. That afternoon, Diane met me in a conference room with no windows. 3 folders were waiting at my chair. One contained ordinary estate protections. One contained documents relating to the Fulton property. The third carried a lender's logo I did not recognize. I asked what she had done. She turned the folders face down. "First, I want you to understand one thing," she said. "From this point forward, Marcus is going to make decisions based on what he thinks is true. We are not going to correct his assumptions for him. We are also not going to lie. If he reads every page, hires counsel orders, a current title report, and asks the right questions, he can walk away from every bad decision available to him." I asked whether my property was safe. Diane said yes. I asked whether anything she wanted me to sign would depend on a false statement to a bank, a buyer, or a court. She said no. Then she slid the first folder back toward me and told me to read. It took nearly 2 hours. She made me initial every page I understood and stop at every sentence I did not. When we finished, she took the documents away instead of leaving copies on my desk. The second folder stayed closed. So did the third. "You will see those when the timing is right," she said. The mystery irritated me, which was probably why I trusted it. Diane had spent 20 years protecting me from deals that sounded too clever. If she was moving slowly now, there was a reason. On the way home, I passed the Fulton warehouse. Rain had darkened the brick and turned the loading dock black. A television truck was parked half a block away, filming the neighborhood for another story about Apex. I did not stop. For the first time since Marcus pushed the deed back across the steakhouse table, I felt no urge to make him understand what he had rejected. Understanding was his responsibility now. 2 days later, Diane took me through a private entrance at Apex Innovations. Arthur Sterling, the chief executive, was already inside the conference room with his general counsel and a development map spread across the table. He opened at $30 million. I told him he was not buying a warehouse. He was buying the ability to keep a $1.2 billion project on schedule. He raised the offer to 35. I stood up and collected my purse. Arthur asked me to sit back down. $40 million, I said. Cash consideration, a clean closing process, confidentiality until my counsel released me from it, and no direct contact with Marcus or Chloe about my affairs. Arthur looked toward his counsel. The lawyer asked Diane 3 questions about title and 1 about my authority to sell. Diane answered with documents I had not seen since the conference room meeting. Arthur's counsel studied them, made a call, and returned 10 minutes later. He did not explain the paperwork to me in front of Arthur. He only said his title team was satisfied with the structure and would proceed to final due diligence. That was enough. Arthur agreed to a gross $40 million transaction subject to the normal closing conditions and a $5 million project reserve covering demolition, remediation, transfer expenses, and redevelopment obligations. Roughly $35 million would remain for the long-term family trust after those reserved costs. I signed the purchase agreement where Diane indicated and watched Arthur sign his copy. Then Diane took both originals. I asked when the money would actually move. After the closing conditions, she said. Not before. I asked whether Marcus could interfere. Anyone can interfere, she replied. The question is whether they have a right to. She would not say more. The silence told me that the second folder from her office had mattered. On the drive home, Trey called. Chloe had sent the backdated document to another lender, and Marcus had left a voicemail at Apex demanding that someone call him about his family's parcel. I told Trey not to respond and not to chase their messages. He sounded frustrated. Nana, they are moving fast. Good, I said. Let them move. That evening, Marcus called me himself. His voice was warm enough to melt butter. He said he had been thinking about the warehouse and felt terrible about how he behaved at dinner. Maybe we should revisit that gift, he suggested. I asked which gift. He inhaled so sharply I heard it through the phone. The building mom, Fulton Market. I told him I thought I had thrown those old papers away. There was a long silence, then the warmth vanished. He asked whether Diane had been in the house. I said I could not remember. He hung up without saying goodbye. Less than 5 minutes later, Chloe called and invited me to lunch. I declined. She offered to come over and organize my files. I declined again. At 9 that night, a car slowed twice in front of my house before driving away. Trey wanted to check the cameras. Diane told him there was no need to play detective. We already knew who was nervous. The more interesting question was what they would do when pressure replaced patience. Pressure arrived in the form of a courthouse notice. Marcus had filed his emergency conservatorship petition and asked for temporary authority over my liquid accounts. He attached Dr. Vance's evaluation 3 photographs of me looking disoriented and statements from 2 distant relatives who said Marcus had told them I was declining rapidly. Diane read the packet once, set it down, and asked whether I wanted to attend the emergency hearing in person. Absolutely, I said. She shook her head. Not yet. Let the documents speak first. The hearing lasted less than an hour. I listened by secure audio from Diane's office, while another attorney from her firm appeared before the judge. Dr. Vance's report claimed severe cognitive impairment, but the independent evaluations contradicted him. The toxicology report showed a sedative in my system during the period he examined me. Diane's attorney did not accuse Marcus of poisoning me in open court. He simply asked the judge not to hand control of $8 million to a petitioner while the medical circumstances were disputed and while evidence tampering concerns were under review. The judge denied immediate control and scheduled a fuller evidentiary hearing. Marcus's lawyer requested temporary access to pay my bills. The judge asked for proof any bill had gone unpaid. There was none. She denied that too. By lunchtime, Marcus knew his fastest route to my cash had closed. He came to my house before sunset. This time there were no flowers. He pounded on the door until I opened it and demanded to know why I was fighting the family. I let my eyes wander past him toward the street. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. You are making this harder than it needs to be. I asked what this was. He stared at me for a long second and changed direction. He said the court process was only meant to protect me, then asked whether I still had the deed from dinner. I smiled as if the question amused me. The brown envelope, I think I burned it. His face changed so quickly it was almost frightening. He left without another word. Trey, watching from the upstairs landing, did not speak until the car disappeared. He asked what Diane's next move was. I told him I did not know. That was not entirely true, but I was beginning to understand why Diane kept the architecture of her plan compartmentalized. Marcus had spent his whole life reading my face. If I did not know every detail, I could not accidentally give him one. The following morning, Diane called and told me to come downtown wearing something comfortable. When I arrived, the 3rd folder from her conference room was on the table. Beside it sat a banker with a legal pad, a stack of disclosure forms, and no interest in family drama. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. The banker asked about receivables, reserves, guarantees, and change of control. Diane answered most of the questions. I answered the ones about my own capacity and finances. Every statement was documented. Every number was real. When I finally signed, the banker collected the packet and left. I asked Diane what I had just armed. She capped her pen and said, "A choice. Nothing happens unless someone else makes it." The choice began taking shape on Wednesday. A courier delivered a leather-bound binder so thick it looked absurd on my dining room table. The cover read, Master Transfer of Ownership and Operating Rights for Fulton Brick Holdings. I opened it at random and found pages of definitions, schedules, acknowledgments, lender consents, manager, warranties, tax language, and signature blocks. Diane had not hidden anything in invisible ink. The problem was almost the opposite. Everything was there. She made me sit at the table while she walked through the document from the first page to the last schedule. When I asked why certain sections repeated the same warning in slightly different language, she said repetition was deliberate when money and future lawsuits were involved. I asked her whether Marcus would understand the document if he read it with a competent lawyer. Yes, she said. Then there is nothing else I need to know. She raised an eyebrow but did not argue. Trey arrived near the end of the review, carrying a printout he had found in a folder Marcus had synced months earlier. It was a credit monitoring report Marcus had downloaded after a Chapter 11 filing. Diane verified the bankruptcy through public records instead of relying on Trey's copy. She looked at the report, then at one page in the binder, and quietly asked one of her associates to revise a cross-reference. I asked what the number changed. She told me it did not change the truth of any disclosure. It changed which provision would matter if Marcus chose to accept control. That was the closest she came to explaining. I let it rest. At 6 that evening, Chloe appeared unexpectedly. She wore a cream coat, carried a bakery box, and looked past me the moment I opened the door. She said she had brought my favorite lemon cake. I said I was not hungry. She set it on the counter anyway and began talking about the vow renewal she and Marcus were planning for Saturday. The invitation had not yet reached me. She called it a celebration of family healing and new beginnings. Her eyes moved toward the dining room where the leather binder sat under a folded newspaper. I followed her gaze. She asked what the book was. I told her Diane had left me homework. Chloe laughed too quickly. Business homework. At your age? I shrugged and asked whether she wanted tea. She crossed the room and placed one hand on the back of the dining chair nearest the binder. Then the doorbell rang. Trey stood outside holding a grocery bag. Chloe stepped away from the table before I even reached the door. She stayed another 10 minutes talking about centerpieces and church friends, but the binder had become the third person in the room. When she left, Trey asked if that had been intentional. The binder, I said. No, the doorbell. He smiled. Completely. Diane had told him to stop acting like a hacker and start acting like a grandson. Apparently he was learning timing. The official invitation arrived the next morning by courier embossed in gold and addressed to Mrs. Vivian Hayes and guest. The card called Saturday's event a vow renewal, but the accompanying program draft told a different story. Beneath the ceremony was a section titled Family Legacy Announcement. Marcus had given himself 15 minutes on stage. Chloe had given herself 10. My name appeared beside a final line, blessing and transfer. Diane read the program and handed it back without comment. I asked whether she thought they expected me to sign something publicly. She said she expected them to do whatever they believed would make refusal socially difficult. That afternoon, the phone calls began. An aunt I had not spoken to in 8 months told me Marcus was stepping up beautifully. A church elder said he was praying for me and praised Chloe for sacrificing so much to manage my appointments. A former business associate asked whether rumors about my retirement were true. I answered none of their assumptions. I thanked them for calling and changed the subject. The pattern told me Marcus had already staged the room before anyone entered it. By Friday, people were speaking about my incapacity as if a judge had declared it. Chloe came over once more carrying garment bags. She said she had chosen a softer dress for me because bright colors might be overstimulating. I told her I already had something to wear. She reached for my closet anyway. I closed the door with one hand. For half a second, her smile disappeared. Then it returned. Of course, Mama Vivi. Whatever makes you comfortable. On her way out, she saw the leather binder again. This time, she did not ask about it. She photographed the cover while pretending to check a message. Trey caught the movement from the hallway camera and showed me later. I watched the clip once and told him to save it. No commentary, no speeches. On Saturday morning, Diane called with 3 instructions. Bring the binder. Do not volunteer an explanation of any page. If Marcus or Chloe want signatures from anyone, make them sign their own acknowledgments too. I asked whether she would attend. She said no. Their own cameras would be better witnesses than my lawyer standing beside me. That answer made me laugh for the first time in days. Trey arrived at 6 in a navy suit and tied his necktie twice because his hands were shaking. I fixed the knot for him. He asked what would happen if Marcus suddenly hired a lawyer at the ballroom and read the whole binder. Then he walks away, I said, and we go home. Trey studied my face. You would really let him? Yes. The point is not to make him fall. The point is to stop him from pushing me over. If he finally chooses caution, that is his choice. Trey nodded slowly. That distinction seemed to steady him. We left the house at 6:30 with the binder in my briefcase and no guarantee about what Marcus would do with it. During the drive downtown, I stopped rehearsing. I had spent days thinking about how a confused woman should move, how long she should take to answer, where her eyes should drift. Too much performance would look like performance. I decided to do less. Slower steps, shorter answers. Let Marcus fill the silence himself. The Grand Magnolia Ballroom came into view beneath a line of black cars and valet lights. Through the windows, I could see white flowers stacked taller than some of the guests. Marcus had chosen spectacle over restraint, even while his mortgage was collapsing. Trey looked at the entrance and whispered that half the people inside believed they were attending a love story. "Let them," I said, turns on. Before we got out, he checked the small recorder clipped inside his jacket. Diane had confirmed that Illinois law and the public nature of the event allowed us to preserve the statements being made openly, and the venue's own videography team would capture the stage from 3 angles. We were not controlling screens, hacking speakers, or manufacturing a surprise broadcast. Marcus had hired the cameras himself. That mattered to me. If the night became evidence, I wanted it to be evidence he created while believing the room belonged to him. I carried the briefcase. Trey offered his arm. At the doors, I let my shoulders fall slightly and slowed my breathing. A pair of churchwomen spotted me first. Their faces softened with pity. One took both my hands and said Marcus had told them how brave I was being. I thanked her and asked whether dinner had started. She glanced at Trey with the kind of sadness people reserve for children watching a grandparent fade. Marcus appeared before we reached the ballroom floor. He wore a white tuxedo jacket and the expression of a man who had already won something. He hugged me for the cameras, then kept one hand around my upper arm. "Smile, Mom," he murmured. "Just follow along tonight." I looked up at him and asked whether this was his birthday. His fingers tightened. Behind him, Chloe saw the briefcase in my hand. Her eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to the case. She kissed my cheek and told a photographer to get a picture of 3 generations together. Trey stood beside me without smiling. The flash went off. For one perfect fraction of a second, the photograph captured exactly what Marcus wanted the city to see: devoted son sacrificing wife, loyal grandson failing mother. Then Chloe reached for the briefcase. I held on. I told her it was heavy. She said she would carry it for me. I smiled and handed it to Trey instead. Chloe's jaw tightened, but the photographer was still watching, so she smiled too. The quartet began the opening music. Marcus guided me toward the front row. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for him to tell his story into a microphone. I walked through the double mahogany doors of the Grand Magnolia Ballroom at exactly 7 in the evening. The sheer financial waste on display was staggering. Marcus and Chloe had spared absolutely no expense for an event they were funding, with completely empty credit lines. Massive floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and imported orchids suffocated every single dining table. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the 200 guests mingling on the polished marble floor. Waiters in crisp, black tuxedos circulated through the crowd with silver trays of top-tier champagne and imported caviar. They had invited everyone who mattered in our social circle. The entire senior congregation from our church was seated near the front of the stage. Dozens of my former business associates and local community leaders were scattered throughout the massive room. It was a perfectly designed theater of public pressure. Trey walked close beside me in a sharp navy suit, looking older and more serious than any 17-year-old should have to look. He gave me one small nod to confirm the recorder was running and then slipped it back inside his jacket. Around us, the venue's own cameras tracked the arrivals and the stage. I was grateful for the simplicity. No secret technical stunt would decide what happened that night. The decisive facts would be visible to everyone who brought the papers, who announced the transfer, who signed the assumption pages, and who pressured the supposedly confused woman standing beneath the lights. I immediately shifted my physical posture. I dropped my shoulders, rounded my upper back, and let a slight constant tremor enter my hands. I clutched my small beaded purse tightly against my chest, like a frightened child clinging to a security blanket. I let my eyes glaze over, staring blankly at the bright chandeliers, instead of making eye contact with the people greeting me. I shuffled my feet, taking slow, hesitant steps across the marble floor. The whispers began almost immediately. I could hear the hushed, pitying voices of the church elders as I passed their tables. They murmured about how fast my mind had deteriorated. They whispered prayers for my failing health and shook their heads in sorrow. Marcus had done his preliminary work perfectly. He had seeded the narrative of my sudden tragic dementia throughout the community for the past 2 weeks. Now, they were seeing exactly what they had been primed to see. Marcus spotted me from across the room. He was wearing a custom-tailored white tuxedo jacket, holding a heavy glass of scotch, playing the role of the exhausted but devoted son. He hurried over his face, twisting into a mask of deep manufactured sorrow. He wrapped his arm tightly around my frail shoulders, squeezing just a bit too hard. He leaned in close, his breath smelling heavily of expensive liquor and cheap desperation. He whispered directly into my ear, telling me to smile and wave at the pastor. He told me to just keep quiet, sit down, and let him handle everything tonight. I did exactly as I was told. I offered a vacant, trembling smile to the crowd. I let him guide me to a velvet armchair, positioned in the front row, directly beneath the elevated stage. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. A sharp clinking of crystal echoed through the massive ballroom. Chloe stepped up to the silver microphone at the center of the stage. She wore a completely excessive floor-length white sequin gown that dragged heavily across the polished stage floor. She tapped the microphone twice and asked for everyone's attention. The room fell dead silent. 200 faces turned upward to watch her performance. Chloe took a deep, shuddering breath. She manufactured a single perfect tear that rolled slowly down her heavily contoured cheek. She welcomed everyone to the vow renewal ceremony, but she quickly pivoted the focus entirely to me. She looked down at where I was sitting. She told the crowd that this evening was not just about her and Marcus celebrating their marriage. She said it was about family sacrifice. She launched into a deeply emotional, entirely fabricated story about how challenging the past few weeks had been. She claimed that my cognitive health had plummeted into severe, irreversible dementia. She told the congregation that I could no longer remember my own address or safely manage my daily medication. She painted herself and Marcus as selfless martyrs, entirely willing to put their high society lives on hold to become my full-time, round-the-clock medical caretakers. The crowd let out a collective sigh of deep sympathy. Several older women in the front row wiped their eyes with linen napkins. Chloe gripped the microphone stand tighter. She announced that because of my tragic mental decline, the sheer stress of managing my massive commercial real estate portfolio was simply destroying what little health I had left. She declared that tonight, in front of God and the entire community, I was making the brave, noble decision to step down from the throne I had built. She told the room that I was officially gifting the absolute crown jewel of my empire, Fulton Brick Holdings, entirely to Marcus. She claimed I wanted to ensure my legacy was protected in the hands of my capable son before my mind completely faded away into total darkness. The vow renewal was especially cruel because Marcus and Chloe used people who genuinely cared about me as scenery. Before the ceremony, women from church squeezed my hands and told me they were praying for my health. Former employees asked whether I remembered them and tried not to look hurt when I pretended I did not. Marcus had turned their compassion into pressure, knowing that a room full of decent people would applaud any decision presented as medical necessity. I did not blame the guests. They had been given a story by a son who appeared devoted and a daughter-in-law who cried on cue. They had not seen this kitchen footage or the conservatorship emails. As I sat beneath the stage, I listened carefully to the words Chloe chose. She never said I had been diagnosed by a hospital team. She said my decline had been recognized. She never said an independent court had appointed Marcus. She said the family had accepted responsibility. The language was slippery enough to sound official without being precise. Diane had predicted that. Trey recorded the entire speech because the public statements would later matter when compared with the private messages showing the real motive. The more Chloe described their sacrifice, the clearer the contrast became. Marcus walked onto the stage carrying the massive 400-page leather-bound binder Diane had prepared. He set it down heavily onto a velvet-draped podium. He gestured for me to join them. The entire room erupted into a standing ovation, 200 people clapping, completely blinded by the beautiful lie. This was the ultimate pressure trap. They believed I was just lucid enough to understand the shame of a public refusal, but too sedated and confused to fight back against a standing ovation from my own community. I stood up from the velvet armchair. I let my hands shake visibly as I grasped the edge of the stage stairs. Trey moved forward to help me, playing the role of the supportive grandson perfectly. I leaned heavily on his arm, taking each step with agonizing slowness. I kept my face blank, maintaining the empty, frightened expression of a woman who did not fully comprehend her surroundings. When I reached the podium, the applause slowly faded into a tense, expectant silence. When Marcus placed the binder in front of me, he made one final mistake that removed any doubt about voluntariness on his side. He signed the incoming manager acceptance pages first and handed the pen to Chloe. She signed next. Only then did they turn the final transfer signature page toward me. Their own videographer captured the sequence from 3 angles. They had organized the witnesses, selected the venue, brought the documents, and announced the transaction before I ever touched the pen. They believed that spectacle protected them. In reality, it documented exactly who had demanded the transfer and exactly which pages they had accepted. Marcus placed a thick, gold-plated pen into my trembling hand. He flipped open the heavy leather binder, completely bypassing the hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon. He flipped straight to the final signature page. He did not read the terms. He did not check the acceleration clauses. He did not ask his own lawyer to review the document. His haste and his desperate need for $35 million completely erased any basic business sense he ever possessed. He pointed a manicured finger directly at the dotted line. He whispered sharply that I needed to sign the paper right now before I embarrassed myself in front of the entire church. I looked down at the final page Marcus had opened for me. The title was familiar from the binder on my dining room table. My signature line waited at the bottom. Marcus put the gold pen into my hand and whispered that everyone was watching. I let the tip hover over the paper. The room had gone so quiet I could hear a waiter setting a glass onto a tray near the back wall. Marcus leaned closer. "Sign it, Mom." I turned my head toward him. For 1 second, I stopped the tremor in my hand and met his eyes directly. Something in his expression shifted, but only for an instant. Then I signed. Marcus exhaled as if he had been underwater. Chloe rushed to the podium with 2 additional acknowledgement pages from the binder. Diane had insisted that any incoming managers sign their own acceptance pages wherever the packet required it. Marcus barely looked down. Chloe asked whether all of this was really necessary. He told her it was boilerplate and signed first. She followed. The venue camera zoomed in close enough to catch both signatures. Marcus closed the binder, lifted it above his head, and the ballroom erupted. Chloe grabbed champagne from a passing tray and pushed a glass into his hand. Their friends stood. The church tables applauded. Someone shouted congratulations. I stepped away from the podium and let Trey guide me down the stairs. He did not ask whether the plan had worked. Neither did I. Nothing visible had happened. No alarm sounded. No officer entered the room. Marcus had a binder. Chloe had a champagne glass. I had an empty hand. That was all the audience could see, and for the rest of the night, I let them believe it was the whole truth. Sunday morning after the vow renewal, my phone looked like it belonged to someone who had won an election. There were 83 messages. Church friends congratulated Marcus for taking responsibility. Former business contacts asked whether I was officially retired. 2 relatives wanted to know whether they should begin sending property questions to Chloe. I answered none of them. Marcus, meanwhile, answered everyone. By 10 o'clock, he had posted a photograph from the stage showing the leather binder in one hand and his champagne glass in the other. The caption read, "New chapter. Family legacy secured." Chloe reposted it with a string of gold heart emojis and a photograph of herself kissing his cheek. Trey showed me the posts, then waited for me to react. I told him to put his phone away and eat breakfast. At 11, Marcus called a luxury car dealer. I knew because the dealer mistakenly rang my office line looking for verification of a family corporate address Marcus had given him. I told the salesman he had the wrong number. At noon, a broker emailed my assistant asking whether Fulton Brick Holdings wanted to discuss a short-term penthouse lease for its new managing directors. At 1:30, an old lender called Diane because Marcus had requested a 7-figure advance and cited the newly acquired Fulton asset as proof of expected liquidity. Diane did not correct Marcus's story for him. She told the lender to perform its own diligence and make no representation based on anything Marcus said about me. The lender declined the request before sunset. That did not slow him down. He left 3 messages for Arthur Sterling's office demanding an executive meeting first thing Monday. In the first, he sounded confident. In the second, he sounded irritated. In the third, he threatened to take the property to a competing developer if Apex did not respect the new ownership. Arthur forwarded all 3 to Diane. She sent me only the audio, no commentary. I listened once. The most revealing detail was not the threat. It was how quickly Marcus had begun spending money he had not received. Chloe did the same in smaller ways. She ordered new furniture for their North Shore house, placed a deposit on a vacation villa, and told a cousin she was finally going to renovate the kitchen because the liquidity event closes this week. None of those actions were necessary for our case, and Diane told Trey not to collect them obsessively. We were not building a scrapbook of bad character. Still, the calls reached us because Marcus and Chloe were using my companies, my contacts, and my address to make their new status feel real. By late afternoon, Marcus sent me a photograph of the first page of the transfer binder. Under it, he wrote, "Thank you, Mom. I know Saturday was emotional, but you made the right decision." I stared at the message for a long time. There was no question in it. He did not ask how I felt. He did not ask whether I remembered signing. He did not mention Dr. Vance or the court petition. He only wanted a written response that sounded like approval. I gave him none. At 7, Diane came by with takeout and a small overnight bag. She intended to sleep in my guest room because she did not want me alone before the Apex meeting. Trey sat at the kitchen island completing homework while she reviewed a sealed folder. I asked whether everything was ready. She said yes. I asked what would happen tomorrow. She said Marcus would tell us. That answer annoyed me less than it had before. By then I understood the discipline of not narrating a trap before the person inside it chose a direction. We ate noodles from cardboard cartons and did not discuss the binder again. At 9:30, Marcus posted one last photograph from the ballroom. This one showed him pointing toward the ceiling while guests applauded. Trey looked at it and said, "He really thinks that was the ending." I closed the screen. "Tomorrow," I said. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. I was already seated in a leather chair inside Arthur Sterling's executive suite when Diane asked me to move to the side of the room where the morning light did not fall directly across my face. The documents on Arthur's desk were turned face down. He had coffee. I had tea. Neither of us touched our cups. Diane checked the time at 8:58 and said, "Do not speak until I ask you to." At 9:03, the glass doors burst open. Marcus entered first, carrying the leather binder under one arm. Chloe followed in a new designer suit and heels sharp enough to announce every step on the stone floor. They walked past the assistant who tried to stop them. Marcus did not notice me. He went straight to Arthur's desk, dropped the binder onto the wood, and announced that he now controlled Fulton Brick Holdings. He said the company owned the parcel at the center of the Apex development and that the price had just increased to $45 million. Arthur asked him to sit down. Marcus refused. Chloe crossed her arms and said they were done being lowballed by people who thought the family was desperate. Arthur looked at Diane, but Marcus kept talking. He threatened to block access, litigate the project, and if necessary, hire a demolition crew to destroy the warehouse before Apex could build around it. Arthur finally pressed the intercom and asked his general counsel to join them. Marcus smiled as if the arrival of another lawyer could only confirm his power. Diane stepped forward instead. His smile disappeared. He asked why my attorney was in the room. Diane did not answer that question. She asked him to repeat his demand. He did louder this time. $45 million by 5 o'clock. Cash. No contingencies. Diane asked whether he had obtained a current title report before making the demand. Marcus slapped the binder with his palm. "I have the transfer." She asked whether he had read the schedules. Chloe interrupted and said their lawyers could review boilerplate later. Diane asked which lawyers. Neither answered. Then she turned one of the face-down documents over. I could not see the page from my chair, but Marcus could. His eyes stopped moving. For the first time that morning, nobody in the room spoke. Diane turned over a second document, then a third. Marcus looked from one to the next and finally whispered, "What is this?" That was when Diane told me I could come forward. I stood and walked to Arthur's desk without the shuffle, the trembling hands, or the vacant stare Marcus had been showing people for 2 weeks. Chloe saw me first. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Marcus turned slowly. I watched recognition arrive before understanding. Diane placed her finger on the first document. "This is the current recorded title package," she said. Weeks before Saturday's ceremony, Vivian lawfully transferred the Fulton Market warehouse, the land beneath it, and the associated development rights out of Fulton Brick Holdings and into a separate trust. The company kept its name. It did not keep that property. She moved her finger to the second document. "This is the purchase agreement between that trust and Apex Innovations. Apex negotiated with the actual owner. Your transfer of the company on Saturday gave you no right to sell this warehouse because the warehouse was no longer one of the company's assets. Marcus shook his head and said the county website had shown the company name. Diane replied that an old index screen was not a title examination and that the current recorded package controlled. Chloe grabbed the binder and began flipping through it. Diane waited until she reached the real property schedule. There was no Fulton Market warehouse on the list. The room seemed to shrink around them. Marcus asked what exactly I had transferred to them. Diane turned over the third document. This was the part I had refused to explain before the meeting because I wanted their own paperwork to answer the question. Fulton Brick Holdings remained an operating company, and before any transfer, it had entered a legitimate $5 million bridge financing arrangement supported by its existing receivables reserves and my guarantee while I controlled it. The lender had received truthful disclosures. The loan, its change of control terms, and the incoming manager obligations were all listed in the binder Marcus carried onto the vow renewal stage. By accepting control, Marcus and Chloe also signed the separate assumption and guarantee pages attached to the transfer. The lender's consent required qualified incoming guarantors. Marcus's verified credit profile did not meet that standard. Under the clause printed in the packet, the change of control triggered acceleration. The debt was now due under the timetable stated in the lender notice. Diane slid that notice toward him. It was not a magical fine, and it was not a secret debt slipped in after his signature. It was an obligation disclosed in the same binder he had waved above his head, while 200 people applauded. If he had read the asset schedule, he would have seen the warehouse was absent. If he had ordered current title, he would have found the trust. If he had read the liability schedule, he would have found the loan. If he had taken the binder to independent counsel, any competent attorney would have stopped him before he signed. He had done none of those things. That was the only full explanation the plan ever needed. Marcus stared at me as though I had changed languages. Then he turned on Chloe. "You said the building was in the company." Chloe snapped that he had told her the back pages were boilerplate. He accused her of forging the earlier document badly. She accused him of hiding his bankruptcy. Arthur remained seated through the argument until Marcus remembered there was still a buyer in the room. He demanded that Apex pay him something for the company name, for interference, for the trouble, for anything. Arthur told him Apex would pay him nothing because he could not convey the property Apex needed. He also warned that any attempt to enter Damage Cloud or falsely encumber the site would be met with immediate legal action. Marcus looked back at the lender notice. His face had gone gray. I did not tell him he was greedy. I did not have to. He had brought the proof of his judgment into the room in both hands. The elevator doors slid open to the ground floor lobby. The polished marble reflected the bright morning sunlight pouring through the massive glass facade of the Apex building. I walked with a steady, measured pace toward the exit. My posture was perfectly upright, the manufactured tremor in my hands completely gone. The crisp autumn air hit my face as I stepped out onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk. I signaled for my private driver, who pulled the sleek black car up to the curb within seconds. I settled into the plush leather back seat and let the heavy door close, sealing away the noise of the city. I instructed my driver to take me to the Fulton Market district. I wanted to look at my property one last time before the construction crews arrived to tear it down and build their empire. As the car navigated through the heavy morning traffic, my mind played back the chaotic, beautiful destruction I had just orchestrated in Arthur Sterling's office. The image of Marcus collapsing into the chair, the sheer panic in his bloodshot eyes as the reality of a $5 million debt crushed his chest was permanently burned into my memory. He had walked into that building expecting to become a multimillionaire. He walked out owing a ruthless financial institution more money than he could ever earn in 3 lifetimes. My phone vibrated against the leather seat. Trey had sent a brief update. The lender's compliance system had received notice of the ownership transfer and requested the incoming guarantor's credit verification exactly as the contract required. Marcus's score failed the threshold immediately. Counsel for the lender had therefore issued a formal acceleration notice demanding the $5 million principal accrued interest and contract charges within the stated cure period. A courier was already on the way to the North Shore address. The countdown had begun, not because of a mysterious algorithm or a trick buried after the signature, but because Marcus had signed a debt assumption he never bothered to read. I smiled, watching the towering skyscrapers pass by my window. Marcus and Chloe were currently trapped in a rapidly shrinking box of their own design. They had absolutely no liquid cash. Their credit cards were maxed out or declined. Their fraudulent scheme to seize my $8 million trust fund was completely dead. They could not hire a high-priced defense attorney to fight the commercial lender because they could not afford the retainer. They were utterly, completely paralyzed. The car pulled up to the curb on a gritty industrial street in Fulton Market. I rolled down my window and looked out at the heavy, dark brick warehouse sitting on the corner lot. It looked incredibly ordinary. The windows were dusty, the loading docks were rusted, and the roof sagged slightly in the center. To an amateur like Marcus, it looked like a financial liability requiring $40,000 in immediate property taxes. But to Arthur Sterling, and to me, it was the essential keystone required to unlock a billion-dollar technological future. I had held on to this property for 22 years, waiting for the neighborhood to shift, waiting for the exact right moment to strike. It had ultimately served two vital purposes. It funded my family's generational wealth, and it served as the perfect bait to destroy the son who tried to poison my mind. My secure phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. I accepted the call and lifted the device to my ear. A frantic, breathless voice echoed through the speaker. It was Chloe. The background noise was chaotic, filled with the sounds of drawers slamming and heavy objects being thrown across a room. "Vivian," she screamed, her voice stripped of its usual polish. "You have to stop this. You have to call the lender. They just served us with an acceleration demand and notices against everything covered by the guarantees. They are saying Marcus owes more than $5 million under that company debt. You have to reverse the transfer right now." I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest. I spoke with a slow, deliberate calmness, ensuring she heard every single syllable clearly. I told her I could not possibly reverse a legally binding corporate transfer. I reminded her that she and Marcus had forced me to sign those documents on a public stage in front of 200 witnesses. I told her I was simply an old, confused woman who had followed her son's direct instructions. Chloe let out a sound of pure, unhinged desperation. She cursed loudly. She yelled that they both knew I was completely lucid. She screamed that the medical evaluation was completely faked. She admitted directly over the unencrypted cellular line that they had intentionally swapped my blood pressure medication with illegal veterinary tranquilizers. She begged me to show mercy, claiming she only went along with the plan because Marcus threatened to leave her if they lost their mansion. The lender's deadline transformed the argument in the Apex lobby into a race. Marcus called the number on the notice, while Chloe stood beside the security desk, demanding that Diane fix the paperwork. The lender's representative would not discuss the account with me. Marcus was the incoming guarantor now, so the conversation belonged to him. We could hear only his side. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said the company was worth tens of millions. He said the warehouse was being sold. Then he stopped talking and listened. His face changed. He asked whether a wire by the end of the day would cure the default. Another pause. "Where am I supposed to get that kind of cash?" he shouted. The representative apparently answered because Marcus lowered the phone and stared at nothing. Chloe asked what they had said. I told her the lender had already issued notices to the banks holding the accounts covered by their guarantees and had begun exercising contractual remedies. She grabbed his phone and demanded to speak to someone herself. The call disconnected. They left Apex separately, Marcus through the revolving doors and Chloe through the side exit, each trying to reach different bankers. By noon, their joint checking account was restricted, pending review of the lender claim. At 12:15, the leasing company for Marcus's Porsche called about arrears that had been ignored for months. At 1, a repossession truck appeared outside the restaurant where he had stopped to meet a private lender. A bystander filmed him arguing with the driver while the Porsche was lifted onto the truck. The clip reached Trey through classmates before it reached me. I told him not to watch it twice. Humiliation was not evidence. At 1:30, Chloe tried to sell jewelry at a downtown buyer and discovered that several pieces were financed or worth far less than she had bragged. At 2, she called Marcus from the sidewalk and accused him of hiding the bankruptcy. He accused her of spending through her corporate lines. They were no longer speaking as partners trying to solve a problem. They were accountants auditing blame. Diane learned most of this, not through surveillance, but through the flood of creditor calls redirected from old corporate contact information Marcus had used. She told every caller the same thing: Marcus and Chloe controlled their own personal affairs, and no debt should be assumed to belong to me or the trust without documentation. At 3:10, Marcus tried the simplest solution left. He called me. "Mom, I need a bridge, just until Friday." I asked how much. He hesitated before saying $5 million. I nearly admired the audacity. He promised to repay me from the Apex sale. I told him Arthur had already explained there would be no sale to him. Marcus lowered his voice. "Then loan it to me against my inheritance." I said he no longer had an inheritance from me. The silence on the line lasted so long I checked whether the call had dropped. Finally he said, "You planned all of this." I told him I had planned to protect myself. The rest had required his signatures. He hung up. At 4, Chloe arrived at their house first and began pulling luggage from closets. Marcus reached the driveway 20 minutes later in a rideshare because his car was gone. They argued beside the open garage while carrying suitcases toward the SUV Chloe still had access to. A neighbor's doorbell camera later showed Marcus throwing a garment bag onto the pavement and Chloe shoving it back at him. Neither knew police cruisers were already turning onto the street. The financial collapse had done something no speech from me could have done. It stripped away the performance. By the time the first cruiser stopped at the curb, Marcus and Chloe were not a polished couple protecting a sick mother. They were two frightened people trying to leave before the next consequence arrived. I was halfway home when Chloe called. The car's display showed her name, then Marcus's, then hers again. On the 4th call, I answered. A recorded notice announced that the call would be preserved. Chloe did not hang up. She was breathing too fast. She demanded that I undo the transfer. I asked which transfer she meant. The company, she snapped. The loan. All of it. I said nothing. Silence made her fill the space. She said Marcus had promised her the warehouse was still inside the company. She said he had promised the doctor's report would give them control of my accounts before any creditor could touch them. I asked which doctor. Chloe swore, then said Vance's name. She immediately tried to take it back. I asked whether Dr. Vance knew about the medication. Another silence. Then she said, "He knew enough." Marcus shouted in the background for her to end the call. Chloe shouted back that he had destroyed everything. I asked why my capsules had been opened. She began crying, but the tears came with anger rather than remorse. "Because you would not listen," she said. "Because you kept treating us like children while sitting on money we needed." Marcus took the phone from her. "Mom, do not use this against us." I asked whether he was worried about the truth or the recording. He hung up. Diane called less than a minute later because the recording service automatically preserved the file for her case folder. She told me not to call them back. The confession was not perfect, but it was new evidence, and more important, it was voluntary. I watched the city pass outside the window and felt no triumph. I felt tired. At the steakhouse, Marcus had needed everyone to believe he could afford the room. At the ballroom, he had needed everyone to believe he could manage my life. In Arthur Sterling's office, he had needed a chief executive to believe he owned a building. Now on the phone, he needed me to believe that the truth itself was negotiable. I turned off the display and rode the rest of the way home in silence. The official body camera footage and exterior security recordings, which Diane was later permitted to review through the case process, began with the aggressive screech of tires as Marcus's leased Porsche turned into the driveway. The timestamp showed that he and Chloe had returned only minutes before the arrest team moved in. They had luggage in the back seat and loose clothing piled behind the front seats, enough to make it obvious they had been preparing to leave in a hurry. Chloe threw her passenger door open before the engine was even fully turned off. She practically fell out of the vehicle. Her designer heels scraped against the concrete. She was in a state of absolute blind panic. She had clearly ripped off her heavy sequined formal jacket during the chaotic drive. Her expensive makeup was heavily smeared dark mascara running down her pale cheeks in jagged streaks. She sprinted toward the front door, furiously digging through her oversized luxury purse for her house keys. Marcus stumbled out of the driver's side a second later. His custom suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was completely soaked through with terrified sweat. He shouted frantically at Chloe, demanding she unlock the door faster so they could pack their bags, drain the hidden emergency safe, and flee the state before the 5 o'clock banking deadline triggered their total financial annihilation. They did not even get the key into the deadbolt. 4 unmarked black sport utility vehicles and 2 fully marked local police cruisers swarmed the quiet street. They moved with absolute silent military precision. The heavy vehicles surged into the driveway, violently cutting off the entire exit path. The sudden blinding flash of red and blue emergency lights reflected harshly against the massive glass windows of the mansion. A short, piercing blast from a police siren cut through the quiet afternoon air, echoing across the elite neighborhood. Marcus spun around. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. Chloe dropped her expensive purse directly onto the concrete porch. The contents spilled out, but she did not even look down. She backed up against the heavy oak door, her hands trembling violently as she pressed herself against the wood like a trapped rat. Car doors slammed in rapid, terrifying succession. 8 federal agents and local detectives poured out of the vehicles. They fanned out across the driveway, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. They completely surrounded the leased Porsche, cutting off every single possible avenue of escape. A tall, broad-shouldered lead detective stepped forward from the center of the formation. He was wearing a dark windbreaker, his badge prominently displayed on a heavy silver chain around his neck. He walked with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who held every single winning card. Marcus attempted to salvage the situation. I watched on the video feed as his desperate, arrogant survival instincts kicked in. He tried to draw himself up to his full height. He puffed out his chest and attempted to project the commanding, untouchable aura of a senior corporate executive. He demanded to know the meaning of this aggressive intrusion. He shouted that this was a private, gated community. He threatened to call the mayor, claiming he was a highly respected local businessman and that they were making a catastrophic jurisdictional mistake. The lead detective did not even blink. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into the deep pocket of his windbreaker and pulled out a rugged black police-issued digital tablet. He tapped the heavy glass screen twice and turned it around, holding it up directly in front of my son's sweating face. "We are not here by mistake, Mr. Hayes," the detective said, his voice cold and flat, captured perfectly by the body camera audio. "We are here because we received a highly classified, heavily encrypted digital evidence packet delivered directly to the United States Attorney's Office this morning." Marcus stared at the bright screen of the tablet. He swallowed hard. "What evidence?" he stammered, his voice losing its artificial strength. "The evidence began with material your son preserved when he believed his grandmother was in danger," the detective replied. "It has since been corroborated by laboratory testing, independent digital forensics records, and statements." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow to the stomach. His knees actually buckled slightly. He staggered back against the hood of the Porsche. The sheer, overwhelming realization that his own teenage son was the architect of his total destruction completely broke his mind. He shook his head back and forth, gasping for air, unable to comprehend the massive, invisible digital trap that had been silently woven around him inside his own home. The police reached the North Shore house before Marcus and Chloe finished packing. Later, the body camera footage showed 2 suitcases open in the foyer, clothes thrown across the stairs, and Chloe's passport lying on a console table beside a jewelry case. Marcus stepped outside first and demanded to know whether the officers had a warrant. The lead detective said yes and handed him a copy. Chloe appeared behind him holding her phone. She started recording the officers until one of them told her to keep her hands visible. The detective did not give a speech. He asked Marcus to turn around and placed him in handcuffs. Another officer did the same with Chloe. She immediately began talking. "He told me it was legal," she said. Marcus twisted toward her and shouted her name. She kept going. He said Dr. Vance would handle the medical part. The detective told her to stop making statements until she had counsel. She ignored him. Marcus finally understood that every sentence she added created distance between them. He began blaming her for the forged document. She blamed him for the conservatorship petition. The officers separated them and placed them in different cars. Trey and I were not standing in the driveway. Diane had insisted on that. This was no longer a family confrontation. It was an arrest based on evidence that professionals had reviewed independently, the preserved capsules and toxicology results, the kitchen footage, the doctor's payment, recording the forged file analysis, the court filings, and the phone call from the car. Each item had its own chain of custody and its own witness. None needed me shouting from the lawn. When the detective called later, he asked me only one question: whether I felt safe remaining at home that night. I said yes. He advised me not to answer calls from either defendant or discuss the investigation publicly. Then he hung up. The quiet after the call was stranger than I expected. For weeks, every hour had contained a new threat, a new document, a new performance. Now there was nothing to do. I walked into the kitchen and saw the medication organizer on the island. Trey had replaced it with a new one weeks earlier, but I still avoided touching the old spot where Chloe used to stand. He came in carrying takeout cartons and asked whether I wanted to watch television. We ate in the living room without turning it on. Halfway through dinner, he said, "I keep thinking they are going to walk through the door." I told him I did too. That was the first thing either of us said all evening that had nothing to do with evidence. The heavy reinforced glass doors of the federal holding facility slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss. I stepped out of the freezing Chicago wind and into the sterile, heavily guarded reception area of the precinct. The air inside smelled sharply of industrial bleach and stale coffee. Diane was already standing by the primary security checkpoint, holding a fresh stack of sealed legal dossiers. She handed her government-issued identification to the armed guard, sitting behind the thick plexiglass partition. I placed my purse onto the gray conveyor belt of the X-ray scanner and walked through the metal detector. The machine remained perfectly silent. I retrieved my belongings on the other side and joined my attorney. Diane leaned in and informed me that the federal magistrate had officially denied bail for both defendants just 10 minutes ago. She stated that the prosecuting attorney had successfully argued they were severe flight risks due to their offshore contacts. We walked down a long, windowless concrete corridor, illuminated by harsh fluorescent tube lighting. Our footsteps echoed sharply against the bare walls. A heavy-set detention officer carrying a thick ring of brass keys met us at the intersection of Block C. He instructed us to surrender all mobile devices and recording equipment before proceeding into the secure interview sector. I unclasped my phone from its case and handed it over to a secondary clerk. The officer unlocked a thick steel door and guided us into a narrow observation room. The small room contained nothing but a metal desk and a wide pane of one-way reinforced glass looking directly into Interrogation Room 4. I stepped up to the glass and looked through the barrier. Marcus was sitting alone at a scarred aluminum table bolted directly to the concrete floor. His pristine white tuxedo shirt was completely ruined, covered in dark grease stains from the hood of his Porsche and wrinkled beyond repair. Both of his wrists were secured inside heavy steel handcuffs connected to a thick chain wrapped securely around his waist. He was shaking violently, his shoulders hunched forward, staring blankly at the blank wall opposite him. Diane opened her dossier and handed me a copy of the charging documents then in effect. The allegations centered on conspiracy and wire fraud, tied to the forged real estate filings, aggravated elder abuse, connected to the tampered medication, and the scheme to obtain control over my assets through a fraudulent incompetence claim. I did not need invented racketeering labels or theatrical legal jargon to understand the seriousness of it. The evidence was already devastating on its own. I asked to see Marcus under the facility's rules, and after the required clearance, I was escorted into the secure interview room. Before I entered the interview room, Diane warned me not to make promises about charges or sentences. Those decisions did not belong to me. I could provide evidence, pursue civil remedies, and tell prosecutors the impact of the crime, but I could not wave my hand and make a federal case disappear. That fact was strangely freeing. Marcus had spent his entire adult life assuming my money could solve any consequence. For once, even he was asking me for something my wealth could not buy. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, the electronic lock engaging with a loud, absolute thud that made Marcus jolt violently in his metal chair. He snapped his head up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto my face. The chain around his waist rattled harshly against the aluminum table as he desperately tried to lean forward. Tears were streaming freely down his pale, unwashed cheeks. His bottom lip trembled uncontrollably. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out for several agonizing seconds. I walked slowly across the small room, pulling out the single metal chair positioned on the opposite side of the table. I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my skirt with perfectly steady hands. I placed the printed copy of his federal indictment face up on the cold metal surface between us. Marcus stared at the document, then looked back up at me with sheer, unfiltered panic. "Mom, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "We are blood. You cannot let them put me away in a place like this. I am your son." He strained against the restraints and begged me to save him. He offered to blame Chloe, to surrender whatever remained of his assets, to move away, to disappear, to do anything if I would tell Diane to soften my position. He complained that a conviction would destroy his career and his reputation, as though those things had been intact when he decided to chemically impair his own mother. I listened without interrupting. Every promise was about what he might lose. Not one sentence began with what he had done to me. When Marcus asked to see me from custody, Diane advised against it. I went anyway once with the meeting recorded and an officer outside the glass. Marcus entered in restraints and sat across the metal table from me. Without the suit, the car, the expensive watch, and Chloe beside him, he looked smaller than I remembered. He did not begin with an apology. He began with blood. "Mom, I am your son. You cannot let them send me away." I looked at him and remembered the child he had been, because memory does not disappear simply because trust does. I remembered scraped knees school pictures, college graduation, and the first business card he ever handed me. Then I looked at the man in front of me. I told him I could not order prosecutors to forget evidence, judges to ignore filings, or a lender to erase a contract he signed. He said I could pay everyone. I almost laughed. Even now, his first instinct was to turn consequences into an invoice. He leaned forward and whispered that Chloe had pushed the medication idea too far. I asked whether that meant the rest had been acceptable. He looked away. That was answer enough. "You mistook restraint for weakness," I said. "You spent your life watching me survive the Chicago commercial real estate market as a black woman who had to be twice as prepared to be treated as half as certain. You should have learned preparation. Instead, you learned entitlement." I left it there. I did not recite every closing, every inspector, every recession, or every insult from the 1980s. One sentence carried the history. Marcus asked what would happen to the Apex money. That was the only new question he asked all day. I told him the transaction had closed. The gross price was $40 million, the agreed project, and closing reserves had been funded, and approximately $35 million had settled into the long-term family trust. Trey would be a future principal beneficiary, but he would not receive a blank check. Independent trustees' audits, education requirements, and age-based controls would protect the money from him as much as for him. Marcus stared at the table. "So he gets everything." "No," I said. "He gets responsibility. There is a difference." I stood. Marcus finally said he was sorry. Maybe he meant it in that moment. Maybe he meant he was sorry the plan had failed. I no longer needed to decide. The officer opened the door. Outside, Diane handed me my coat. Trey was waiting in the car. I gave him a key to a small temporary office the foundation would use while the trust was organized. He turned it over in his palm and asked whether it meant he was running the company. "It means you have a desk," I said. "Start there." For the first time in weeks, he laughed. The criminal case did not jump from arrest to sentencing. There were months of motions, hearings, expert reports, and arguments designed to make ordinary facts look uncertain. Marcus and Chloe hired separate defense lawyers almost immediately. Their first strategy was to divide responsibility. Chloe claimed Marcus had controlled the finances and pressured her to help with the medication. Marcus claimed Chloe had altered the pills without telling him, and that Dr. Vance had exaggerated my condition on his own. Dr. Vance solved part of that problem for them by deciding to save himself. Faced with the recording of the cash exchange, his evaluation notes, and the toxicology timeline, he entered a cooperation agreement. He admitted that Marcus had asked for an incompetence opinion before conducting a proper independent assessment, and that he had known I was under the influence of a sedating substance when he examined me. He denied supplying the substance, but his testimony linked the medical fraud directly to Marcus's financial objective. Chloe's lawyer attacked him as a man bargaining for leniency. The prosecutor agreed he was bargaining for leniency, and then played the recording in which Marcus told him to file before noon. The jury did not need Dr. Vance to be noble. They only needed to decide whether the recording was real. The digital forensics examiner testified next. He did not call Chloe a liar. He showed creation times, user account records, export history, and the mismatch between the date printed on the backdated property document and the date the file actually came into existence. Chloe's lawyer suggested anyone with access to the laptop could have created it. The examiner pointed to her authenticated user session and the email account that transmitted the file minutes later. Then came the kitchen video. I left the courtroom before it played. I had watched Chloe open those capsules enough times. Trey stayed. When I returned, he was sitting in the hallway with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. I asked whether he wanted to go home. He said no. He wanted to testify and be finished. On the stand, the defense tried to make him look like a brilliant teenager who had invaded his parents' privacy because he preferred his wealthy grandmother. Trey did something I had not expected. He admitted where he had overreached. He said he should not have tried to investigate everything himself, and that once Diane became involved, he stopped. He explained which files had already been synced to devices he lawfully used, and which evidence was later collected by professionals. That honesty took the weapon out of the cross-examination. The defense lawyer asked whether I had promised him the Apex money. No, Trey said. She promised me a desk. A few jurors smiled. I did not. I knew how much courage it had taken him to sit 10 feet from his parents and answer questions about the night he discovered their plan. When my turn came, the prosecutor did not ask me to describe Marcus's character. She asked dates. What did I take the morning of the near crash? When did Chloe refill the organizer? When did Dr. Vance visit? When did I obtain the toxicology report? When did I sign the corporate transfer? The questions were almost boring, which made them powerful. The defense wanted emotion because emotion could be called revenge. The record gave them chronology instead. On cross-examination, Marcus's lawyer asked whether I had wanted to punish my son. I said yes. The courtroom went still. Then I added that wanting punishment did not change the dates on Chloe's file, the substance in my blood, the doctor's recording, or the signatures in the binder. The lawyer changed subjects. By the final week, Marcus and Chloe had stopped looking at each other across the defense tables. When the verdicts were read, neither reacted until the clerk repeated the word guilty on the conspiracy count. Chloe closed her eyes. Marcus stared at the jury. Trey looked straight ahead. I felt no surge of victory. I felt the exhaustion of a door finally closing after months of people arguing over whether the room behind it had ever existed. Sentencing came later. By then, the story no longer depended on my interpretation of anyone's motives. It had been reduced to documents, video, audio, medical evidence, and choices made in public. The morning of sentencing. Trey and I arrived early enough to sit in an empty courthouse cafeteria with paper cups of coffee between us. He had been offered the chance to give a victim impact statement and had spent 3 nights writing one. When he finally handed it to me, the page contained only 6 sentences. None asked the judge for a longer sentence. None defended me. He wrote that the hardest part had been learning to distrust ordinary things, a pill organizer on a kitchen counter, a family dinner, a parent asking for a password, a photograph taken at a celebration. He wrote that he wanted the court to understand that crimes committed inside a family do not stay inside one event. They alter the meaning of routines. Then he ended by saying he did not want his future to be organized around what his parents had done. I gave the page back and told him it was enough. He asked whether I planned to speak. I had prepared nothing. Diane had suggested a short statement, but every version I drafted sounded like another closing argument, and the trial was over. When the judge later asked whether I wished to address the court, I stood and said only that I wanted the sentence to protect my autonomy, protect Trey from pressure, and recognize the deliberate use of medication and legal process as tools of control. I did not ask the judge to hate my son. I did not ask for mercy either. Marcus looked at me while I spoke. Chloe stared at the table. Their lawyers had spent months turning every emotion into a possible motive, so the absence of spectacle felt clean. When I sat down, Trey folded his 6-sentence statement and placed it back in his pocket without reading it aloud. The judge told him he did not owe the courtroom his pain. He nodded. That small exchange stayed with me longer than most of the legal language that followed. For once, an adult had given him permission not to perform. During the short recess before the sentence, Marcus's attorney approached Diane and asked whether I would support contact between father and son after imprisonment. Diane looked to Trey instead of answering for him. Trey said he wanted all future contact to go through the court-approved process and that he did not want private messages carried through relatives. The attorney nodded and walked away. Marcus watched the conversation from the defense table but could not hear it. I did not translate it for him with my face. Trey had spent weeks being treated as a piece on someone else's board. That morning, he made one decision about his own boundaries in his own voice without asking me what I preferred. I realized that was more important than any inheritance document I had signed. Months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom swung shut with a hollow and absolute thud. I sat in the front row of the gallery, resting my hands calmly on my leather purse. The air inside the room was stale and heavy, with the metallic scent of floor polish and nervous sweat. Behind me sat people who had once crowded Marcus and Chloe's parties and praised their success. Most had not come to offer support. They had come because public collapse attracts the same people who once admired public display. A heavy iron door opened on the far side of the room. 2 armed federal marshals escorted Marcus and Chloe into the courtroom. The transformation was physically jarring. Marcus was stripped of his custom-tailored suits and silk ties. He wore an oversized, violently bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were securely bound in thick steel chains that rattled loudly against the polished floor with every shuffling step he took. His face was pale sunken and covered in an uneven layer of dark stubble. He looked entirely broken. Chloe walked a few steps behind him. Her posture was completely shattered. She kept her head bowed deeply, her unwashed hair falling in greasy strands across her face. The designer heels she had worn on the day of the raid were replaced by cheap, slip-on canvas shoes. They took their seats at the defense table, keeping their heads down, unable to make eye contact with a single person in the gallery. The bailiff ordered the courtroom to rise. The federal judge took her seat at the high mahogany bench and opened the sentencing materials. The evidence had been reviewed, motions had been argued, and both defendants had entered dispositions that left the court to determine punishment. The judge did not waste time on spectacle. She looked directly at Marcus and Chloe and described the case as a calculated scheme in which financial desperation had crossed into deliberate abuse. She addressed Marcus and Chloe. She stated that in her 30 years on the federal bench, she had witnessed countless variations of corporate greed and financial desperation. She noted that people often made terrible decisions when cornered by crippling debt. But she raised her voice, letting it carry sharply across the silent room. She declared that the sheer calculated cruelty required to chemically sedate an elderly mother, forge federal real estate documents, and manipulate an entire church congregation was a level of depravity that demanded maximum judicial retribution. The judge systematically listed their offenses for the official court record. She read the charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She detailed the exact timeline of the unauthorized commercial loan application. She read the charges of aggravated elder abuse, citing the precise chemical breakdown of the veterinary tranquilizers found in my bloodstream. She confirmed the digital forensics report proving Chloe had manipulated the corporate network from her personal laptop. She noted that neither defendant had shown an ounce of genuine remorse until the exact moment they realized they had personally triggered a $5 million default acceleration clause. She asked the defendants to rise. Marcus struggled to his feet, his restraints clinking softly. Chloe had to steady herself against the defense table. The judge sentenced each of them to 12 years of imprisonment on the combined offenses, followed by supervised release restitution obligations and a permanent protective order barring contact with me, except as any future court might expressly authorize. The exact legal labels mattered less to me than the simple fact that a court had recognized what they had done. The story. Marcus wanted to tell about a confused mother and 2 devoted caretakers had collapsed under evidence. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, decisive crack. Chloe let out a sudden, ragged sob. Her knees buckled completely. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing her by the arms and dragging her upright. Marcus simply stared straight ahead at the wood paneling of the judge's bench. His eyes were completely vacant. He had nothing left to say, nothing left to barter, and absolutely nothing left to sell. I turned my head slightly and looked at this gallery behind me. The country club elites and the corporate associates who had gladly drank Marcus's expensive champagne at the fake vow renewal ceremony were already standing up. They did not wait to offer condolences. They turned their backs and walked swiftly out of the double doors, eager to distance themselves entirely from the toxic fallout of a federal conviction. Within seconds, the gallery was empty. Marcus and Chloe were entirely alone. The marshals turned them around and marched them back through the heavy iron door, returning them to the concrete cells where they would spend the next decade of their lives. 6 months after sentencing, the first completed phase of the Apex campus opened on Fulton Market. The architects had preserved a long section of the original warehouse facade, cleaning the dark brick and setting it behind a glass atrium so the old structure remained visible inside the new one. I stood there longer than I expected. A small brass plaque identified the warehouse by its construction date, but said nothing about my family. I was grateful for that. Not every scar needs a public explanation. Trey met me near the entrance carrying a tablet and wearing a suit that still looked slightly too formal on a 17-year-old. He was not an executive despite what several newspapers had lazily called him. He was finishing school working part-time with the foundation and sitting in meetings where independent trustees regularly told him no. I considered that excellent training. I took me upstairs to a conference room where the Hayes Matriarch Foundation was holding its first grant review. There were no chandeliers, no champagne towers, and no photographers. 3 nonprofit directors, an accountant, a retired judge, 2 educators, and Trey sat around a plain table reviewing proposals. One application came from a neighborhood legal clinic seeking funds to help older homeowners obtain independent advice before signing powers of attorney reverse mortgages or complicated property transfers. Another came from a youth program teaching cybersecurity and digital evidence preservation. Trey wanted to fund both at the maximum amount. The accountant told him the budget could support only one at that level this quarter. 6 months earlier, he might have opened a spreadsheet and tried to prove the accountant wrong. This time, he asked questions, reduced both grants slightly, and found a way to support each without exceeding the allocation. I watched from the end of the table and said nothing. That was the inheritance I wanted to see, not obedience, not brilliance, but the ability to hear a limit without treating it as humiliation. After the meeting, a woman from the legal clinic approached me. She was in her 70s and did not know the details of my case. She only knew the foundation had funded a program that would place independent attorneys in community centers twice a month. My sister signed her house away last year because nobody explained the papers to her, she said. Maybe this keeps another family from going through that. I thanked her. On the elevator down, Trey looked at me and asked whether that one sentence made the entire fight worth it. I told him no. Nothing could make what Marcus and Chloe did worth it, but something useful could still grow afterward. The distinction mattered. Revenge had ended in a courtroom. What we were doing now had to be larger than revenge, or it would remain chained to them forever. We walked out onto the plaza as the afternoon sun caught the preserved brick behind the glass. Trey stopped at the edge of the old wall and ran his hand over one rough corner the restoration crew had left exposed. He said it was strange that the building everyone once called ugly had become the part visitors photographed most. I told him value has a habit of hiding from impatient people. He smiled and asked whether that was another lesson. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I am simply old enough to enjoy being right. He laughed again. Across the street, workers were planting young trees along the sidewalk. None were tall enough to cast shade yet. That seemed appropriate. A legacy is not the money that appears in an account after a closing. It is what people do while the trees are still small when there is no applause, and nobody knows whether the work will last. Marcus had wanted the harvest without the years that made it possible. Trey was learning to sit through budgets, audits, objections, and slow decisions. That was enough for me. I did not need him to become another version of myself. I needed him to become someone who could be trusted with power when nobody was watching. We reached the car, and he opened the passenger door for me. Before I got in, I looked back once at the old brick inside the new glass building. At dinner, Marcus had pushed that deed away because he saw a tax bill and dust. Months later, he reached for a company because he saw a fortune and never stopped to ask what was actually inside it. The same impatience had shaped both mistakes. I had spent too much of my life trying to explain value to someone determined to measure it by appearances. I was finished explaining. I got into the car. Trey closed the door, walked around to the driver's side, and placed his tablet in the back seat instead of on his lap. No evidence, no emergency messages, no secret plan. Just a drive home through Chicago traffic. For the first time since the steakhouse silence felt ordinary. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but occasionally you have to bag it up yourself. Would you have shown your own child mercy, or would you have handed them the exact debt they tried to bury you in? Tell me in the comments.